Good afternoon, and welcome to Dreaming While Awake, the virtual panel culminating the Contemporary Arts Center of New Orleans' celebration of the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. My name is David Robinson Morris, current Regional Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Ochsner Health System and the founding director of the Center for Equity, Justice, and the Human Spirit at Xavier. I will be your moderator for this afternoon's virtual panel discussion addressing the role of art, artists, and art institutions in driving social change. I'll be joined this afternoon by panelists, poet, writer, filmmaker, educator, Kalamu Ya Salaam, CAC artist André Fuqua, Shana Griffin, and Ariel René Jackson, and CAC executive director George Scheer. The title of this panel is not by chance. Dr. King's final Sunday sermon, given at Washington National Cathedral, just days before his death, was titled, Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution. Dr. King utilized the story of Rip Van Winkle to illustrate how one, if they are not careful, can sleep through the revolution. As you remember, Rip Van Winkle went to sleep as a subject of King George and woke under the presidency of George Washington. King said, one of the great liabilities of life is that all too many people find themselves living amid a great period of social change, and yet they fail to develop the new attitudes, the new mental responses that the new situation demands. They end up sleeping through a revolution. He says there can be no gainsaying of the fact that a great revolution is taking place in the world today. In a sense, it's a triple revolution. That is, a technological revolution with the impact of automation and cybernation. Then there is a revolution in weaponry with the emergence of atomic and nuclear weapons of warfare. Then there is a human rights revolution with the freedom explosion that is taking place all over the world. Yes, we do live in a period where changes are taking place. And there is still the voice crying through the vista of time, saying, behold, I make all things new. Former things are passing away. What does it mean to dream while awake? To be awake, to be woke is an ethical choice as much as it is an inescapable position for those of us who struggle under the violence of white supremacy and capitalism, yet survive, or should I say, daily escape Black death. I love the words of Lucille Clifton, which speak so poignantly to the Black and marginalized condition in America. Clifton says, come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. Today, we celebrate a king who left us with a blueprint for liberation. The dream. Dr. King's dream has been bastardized and sanitized, but still offers for the oppressed the hope and the righteous rage necessary to force this country to live its ideals no matter how much it continues to fail. Hannah Black writes of Christina Sharp, anti-Blackness exists not because of some amorphous fear of the unknown or mysterious viral tendency toward racism, but because of this specific history of Black diaspora and white capitalist violence and the continuing relationship between the two. She says, for 500 years, slavery scattered people of African descent all over the world. She ends with this question: how can this inexpressible loss be expressed in language? And yet it can be through poetry and art. This is where the artist comes in. In the midst of all of this hell, I'm grateful for art and the artist. Like Queen Mother Toni Morrison, my faith in the world of art is intense, but not irrational or naive. Art invites us to take the journey beyond price, beyond cost, into bearing witness to the world as it is and as it should be. Art invites us to know beauty and to solicit it from even the most tragic of circumstances. Art reminds us that we belong here. and if we serve, we last. My faith in art rivals my admiration for any other discourse, Morrison writes. Its conversation with the public and among its various genres is critical to understanding, to a deep understanding of what it means to care deeply and to be human completely. So I say all that to say I cannot tell you how excited I am to be here with you all today to celebrate Dr. King, to have this conversation, to learn, and to dialogue with each of you. Now, please allow me to introduce Mr. Kalamu Ya Salaam, who will share with us his artistry. Mr. Salaam.
Hello, my name is Kalamu Ya Salaam. It's Kiswahili, means pen of peace. And I'm going to share with you a poem, I'm a Citizen in the Country of Your Smile. And it's written as one person talking to another, a male talking to a female, but it's not written as though it was an individual. In a sense, it's all of us talking to our partners, whomever our partners may be, and our partner explaining to us, you want to be with me? Well, here are the conditions. And so I am a citizen in the country of your smile. I was looking for myself, confused by the store-bought maps, none of which led directly to me. All the interstates and curious detours, some straight through your heart. One or two were back roads, small moments. No, not many malls, but one-room country stores. Everything from chicken feed to calico cloth, candy, and pickled pig feet in big glass jars. A catalog for ordering something else from somewhere else. I lay listening to your breathing, my head between your breasts, my lips longing to suck your relaxed nipples to erectness, that taste moving my tongue. My hands exploring everywhere. An amateur urban planner mapping layouts for a futuristic city of light and love. You open your thighs and say you need beaches on the borders and kisses in the nether regions. Plus you tell me, quote, you must volunteer to share all chores. Soap and water have no gender. Brooms nor mops have genitals. And if you don't want to, I don't want you to. We can agree to disagree, but fighting is forbidden. There may be war in the world, but there will be peace in this village. Think about who I am before you say you want us to be. I paused, I listened, I surrendered, happy with the terms of agreement. I sincerely pledged allegiance.
Thank you, Mr. Salaam.
You're welcome.
Now it's my honor to invite our panelist, André Fuqua, Shana M. Griffin, Ariel René Jackson, and CAC Executive Director George Scheer to join us. Welcome. Before we get into our questions for tonight's panel, I want to invite each of you just to introduce yourselves, tell us a bit about who you are and what you'd like us to know about you. And then I'll ask the first question. Let's start with Ariel.
Hello. Thank you so much, David. And thank you, Mr. Salaam, for your beautiful words and narrative. So my name is Ariel René Jackson. I am primarily an image and research multidisciplinary artist with a focus on land representation and storytelling. And I'm interested in concepts of belonging and how culture is learned by way of repurposing objects, stage making, and performance of the archived memory. My work in the exhibition is called The Future is a Constant Wake, that I did in collaboration with my friend, Michael J. Love, who is a very talented choreographer and tap dancer. And I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel. Shana.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Kalamu, for sharing such a beautiful, intimate poem. And also, I would like to thank the CAC for inviting me to participate in this MLK activities this weekend and this week, I should say. Again, my name is Shana M. Griffin. I am a feminist activist, independent researcher, applied sociologist, artist, and geographer. My practice is interdisciplinary and undisciplinary, centering historical inquiry rooted in Black feminist thought, practice, and organizing traditions. Much of my work exists across the fields of sociology, geography, land use planning, and socially engaged art practices within movements challenging urban displacement, carcerality, reproductive control, and gender-based violence. My current work at the CAC, showcase that's on exhibit at the CAC, is called Displacing Blackness, Cartographies of Violence, Extraction, and Disposability.
Thank you, Shana. André.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you, David, for the introduction. Again, thank you, Mr. Salaam. And I'm just very happy to be here today and to be able to be a part of this conversation. Again, my name is André Fuqua. I am a sculptor, photographer, and designer. Most of my work revolves around social hierarchies and structure and material ethos. My work is inspired by my Southern heritage. I feel like I have had a very much of a privilege to experience migration in America, being from St. Louis, Missouri, but spending lots of time in New York, and then having very strong ties to a very small town in Alabama where my family is from. And I'm interested in how objects and ideals kind of move in that process. And how they're transformed from place to place, and then the different symbolisms that are either maintained or erased in that process. Yeah.
Thank you, Andre. And George.
Hi, David. Thank you so much. Mr. Salaam, thank you. And thank you to everyone here. It's really quite an honor and a pleasure to get to spend this day with you all and to have a conversation of substance with you all. My name is George Shear. I'm the executive director at the Contemporary Arts Center here in New Orleans. And I also am a writer, and a lot of my research and writing is around cultural economy of art and urbanism, also looking at issues of archiving and catastrophe and the development of museums and institutions during moments of catastrophe, particularly during the Second World War. Yeah, I think my thinking in these moments is a lot around issues of how the institution is part of this larger revolution, and how institutions are instruments of social change.
Wonderful. Thank you, George. Thank you all. This is going to be a great discussion. I'm going to open with a question for Mr. Salaam, who is our senior and who has been at this art as activism for quite a long time. Your words, Mr. Salaam, for decades have been both a balm for people to soothe and the strike of a drum that awakens our readiness to rage. And even what you shared with us here today was such an intimate poem, right? And took us to places I didn't expect to go on a Zoom call this afternoon. But can you speak to us today about the power of words, the power of art as activism, and the ability of language to speak us into and out of being?
Language presupposes relationships. If there were no relationships, there would be no reason for language. If you're only talking to yourself, you don't need a language. If you're talking to someone else, you need a language that they understand and you understand. And it doesn't help if they don't understand the language you're speaking, or vice versa, you don't understand the language they're speaking. So there's a sociology to language that happens, and part of it, we have to figure out oftentimes how to make sense to each other and with each other. And that's what language is about. Language is not just about a self-expression. Language is not just about saying what you have on your mind, or that whole self-expression, so forth and so on, which is what we are too often taught rather to be the purpose of language in the United States, self-expression. It's not simply that. So that it's important, I think, to understand that if you're going to use a language, you're using it with someone or someone's community or what have you. And it's not just an individual moment, if you will. You were saying that the poem took you some places you didn't think you would be going. And as the woman says, if you don't want to, I don't want you to. I mean, if you don't want to get together with someone, I don't want to get together with you. This all is that simple. But understand, if you're going to get together with me, you got to deal with brooms and mops. It's not about gender. It's about doing the work. I'll leave it at that because I really want to hear other people. I can go on and on and on and on and on and on and on.
Beautiful. That's beautiful. And it gives us an entry point. First of all, to the panelists, please, this is a conversation. Don't wait on me to ask you a question, okay? Because I can also get lost in one question and we'll be there for the hour. So please interject.
Yeah, thank you for that, David. And yeah, I wanted to respond. I'm taking notes. I hope that's okay. I think about my own use for poetry and how I understand it, and in thinking about how I'm trying to communicate disparate ideas and feelings and emotions, but to communicate, but to also have permission to not be seen. Like this question of like, you will understand me. I think historically it's been used very violently. And I feel that while there is this sort of relationship with people using language, or that relationships require a language, that language doesn't necessarily need to be spoken. And sort of, I love poetry for sort of how it paints a picture for me that is both a collection of feelings, seemingly disparate ideas, that creates a dialogue. So I was inspired by listening to you talk about language and its relationship to relating to others and to communicate yourself. Because I love the philosopher Edward Glissant and his demand for opacity and the demand to not be understood. Because historically, this idea of trying to understand has been a colonial tool. And so I'm always thinking about like who's trying to relate to who and for what purpose. It's not always necessarily. I'm trailing on, please somebody interrupt. But yeah, just my mind is going a couple places that are very rich.
Do you speak French?
I'm sorry?
Parlez-vous français?
Louisiana. I understand it more than I speak it, but you know, I took some classes in high school. I listened to my grandma. I know when she's talking about me. That's as far as I got.
I love it. I love it. I like when the Louisiana response. I was saying to myself, je ne parle pas français, but Louisiana, I think, was perfect. Kalamu, I was really, and David, thank you for inviting us to engage in this conversation around language. And Ariel, I was thinking something similar too regarding language. Not so much just as it relates, both thinking about language in this colonial sense, and which is also the opposite in terms of the poem that Kalamu shared, which is the opposite of, you know, a language in which there are no hierarchies, specifically as we're thinking about gender and also labor. Labor when he's referencing the broom and a mop, right? But also the beauty of language and reimagining something different. And when we think about the title of this conversation or the various themes of this conversation around dreaming while awake, like unafraid to explore the possibilities, right? Not necessarily sustaining what currently exists. As it relates to language specifically, I often struggle. I feel like the first time I read A Small Place, Jamaican Kincaid's work, I felt like I finally was able to connect to a language that made sense to me, critiquing the ways in which she critiqued the use of language, or the language that we have to talk about the crime of the criminal that committed the language. And so the tools that we have in terms of our English tongue, that language is also colonial in and of itself. And so we speak a violent language to talk about the violence that has been committed against us. And so I'm struck by that. And I'm also thinking about the ways in which we communicate through language, both verbal and nonverbal, and how art is a tool that we have at our disposal to use. And also it's a tool that can also be very violent and dangerous at the same time. And so to me, thinking about the complexities of language and how we engage and not engage, and also what does it mean to be seen or heard, like those almost, they work together. And this idea of recognition through language. And so as it relates to abolitionist work, I do this idea around what does it mean to be recognized by the state? To be recognized by the state is also to invite the violence of the state. We're appealing to the state to litigate itself, which it would never do. And so I'm not interested in being somebody to be recognized by the state. I'm interested in being a nobody, because I'm committed to dismantling the state. And so I think those are very different ways of engaging through language, to be seen and heard, and to be unseen and unheard. While at the same time, be able to use art to bring attention to the violence that's inherent within this place we call America.
That's quite powerful. And even with the exhibition that's now at the CAC, that your work is a part of, at least for two of you that your work is a part of, it's titled after a line from Baldwin, right? In a letter to his nephew. And so you talk about Baldwin, who I think was a prophet and a master of this language, right? That is violence in some ways. I'm curious, George, since you curated this exhibition along with Dakar Thomas and Katrina Newman, what were you trying to make seen or unseen in the curation of this exhibition?
Sure, thanks, David. It ties to what everyone here is speaking about, this kind of idea of making sense with each other, or language that gives permission not to be seen. When we started exploring the setup of the exhibition back in January, so before the pandemic, and certainly aware of the political times, but had not, been part of sort of the summer of social upheaval and fighting for social justice. The question that really obsessed us was the question of anxiety. Initially, I was looking at W.H. Auden's poem "Age of Anxiety," which takes place after World War II. It's an epic poem showing the sort of dislocation of human beings from the next, but with the interruption of mass communication systems alerting to Allied bombing. And it was in that moment that I picked up a copy of Fire Next Time and started to kind of reread that and look at the letter that is its preface. And it speaks of a different anxiety at a different time, but one in which Baldwin is looking back 100 years and then speaking to his nephew at the time of its writing. And it's an anxiety, among other anxieties, I think, that are present there. There's an anxiety he's describing the anxiety that white America is feeling, that white supremacy is feeling. An anxiety that sees, and there's a line right before the line itself that we took the title from, where it sort of describes this, imagine waking up and finding all the stars misaligned. That white perception of Blackness has suddenly come unhinged or been separated from what became in its invisibility, in a kind of way, a guide star to understanding power. And so, those are some of the, and then of course we come upon this phrase, "Make America what America must become," which has so much complicated resonance today. And now is certainly the battle cry of insurgency, which was not perhaps what everyone would think as of 4 days ago, though many of us felt. It was compelling in the sense that, as an institution and as a curator, to invite artists to speak, to hear what artists have to say. And I think that's one of the best places that institutions, contemporary art institutions specifically, can position themselves, is to open up a capacity for artists to speak and to hear what is to be said. And so that became the call. And that's what evolved into the exhibition, was an opportunity for artists to respond to what America must become. So I would just end by saying that the anxiety is often around language and who controls language, and how perhaps certain forms of sense that are not apparent to us guide our even capacity to see.
Love that. Any comment or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I have a comment. As we're talking about language, I am, I guess, thinking throughout my work in the show and just kind of like my practice in general. And, this ideal of symbolism, I think that it's, as we communicate with one another, it can be beneficial, I guess, to play with symbols, or kind of understanding, how these symbols, again, move from one place to the next and might, have a specific meaning from one person to another. I guess, maybe I'm moving too fast in the conversation, but my piece in the show, one of my pieces in the show is named Seal. And that specific piece is my iteration of an American flag. And the piece is made out of steel, and instead of the stars on the flag, they're all silhouettes of my head. So as we're talking about this ideal of visibility, invisibility, you know, me showing myself, but, you know, if you don't know me, it could be any guy. It's interesting as I, you know, have shown that piece in many spaces and how it communicates differently to different people. You know, like some people see it as, you know, kind of this, like a part of like the Black geometry, I guess, like kind of this unspoken language that's like, okay, you're obviously addressing issues of, you know, visibility, Black voices not being heard. You know, I show it to other people and they're like, oh, it's an American flag and it's really cool that you made it out of steel. And who's that guy? So just, I guess, speaking towards like the ambiguity that can exist, you know, in language, how there can be power in that, you know, this ideal of visibility, invisibility, and, you know, how there is beauty in all of that, I guess.
That what you pointed out about disrupting the flag and just in general where this conversation seems to be going is like peppered with keywords like dream, you know, being awake, this disruption. And actually, the title of the exhibition, Make America What America Must Become, made me think of Langston Hughes' poem, Let America Be America Again. And it's like this phrase keeps coming up again and again. And not to take up too much space right now, but the construction of that poem is pretty brilliant because it's two voices speaking through one voice. You have what I think of as the sort of the idea of the American dream, the white ideal, the immigrant ideal, and then the other voice are those who have been here, and what the reality of it is. And so like the first exchange is, let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain, seeking a home where he himself is free. And then in response, the voice says, America never was America to me. So it's like the poem then goes in and just sort of says, in a lot of ways, when we are not able to see ourselves in each other, we'll never be there. Because we'll always be fighting each other's concepts of a dream rather than letting each of us dream. And this idea of dreaming while awake, I think has been something that you learn is a constant state of existence when you see yourself in the hierarchy of the disenfranchised in the US, in the Americas. And I think that realization that the dream is not right now, but the dream is sort of how the dream is what I can bring into existence. I think that's why the arts is so influential and so important for Black people, for Brown people, because it enables us to envision what it can be again. Because I think that again it's complicated. Let America be America again sounds like a Trump supporter, like saying, you know, let's go back to the good old days. Right. But at the same time, I think that because if you think about the fact that it's a Langston Hughes poem, Langston Hughes is saying these words also, saying that let America be America again. And for me, that feels like we need to pay respects to what it was before that idea of what we think America should be again. I think it's a fascinating poem. It's sort of what made me want to submit to the open call, because I was like, oh, Langston Hughes, like one of his poems that people are not necessarily familiar with, and it's interesting that people aren't talking about it a lot. Maybe they're afraid to, because let America be America again, that sounds like a PR disaster. But at the same time, if you read this and you think about the fact that Langston Hughes has combined several different types of experiences in one poem, I think that's very American in terms of how we've all kind of like shared this dream of what does it mean to be America? Does it mean that we're just all racist? Does it mean that we can be better? Does it mean that we all carry prejudices? Does it mean that we are all disenfranchised? But yeah, in saying that, I wanted to connect that point to what Andre was talking about in terms of disrupting the flag. And I think it comes down to, for me, I think it comes down to a sense of ownership of these symbols and not a sense of allegiance to how they've been used to terrorize and to torture people. And I think when we revisit them, in this way, it pisses people off. Anytime you use a flag, you might, somebody will be like, why are you doing that to that flag? People get really touchy about the flag. And it's like, well, I think the symbolism of that flag needs to be interrogated and it needs to be manipulated.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with the interrogation and the manipulation of this symbol that has become hardened over time, right? And we're not, feels like we're not working with an evolution of a thing, right? But we're stuck on, and language does this when we talk about language. Language can sometimes close things off and stop us from dreaming or creating. But I want to also talk about this point that George brought up about anxiety, right? Because it seems like right now all hell's breaking loose and everybody's anxious in this country. And for almost a year, we know we've been battling a global pandemic. We have witnessed Black and brown people be killed in the streets at the hands of American law enforcement. And we have witnessed the complete failure of government and national leadership, right? That makes everyone anxious, right? And now we're experiencing the fragility of the idea of America at the hands of white thugs or homegrown terrorists. And so that last line from Baldwin always makes me pause, because while Baldwin is critiquing the US, he's still invested in its becoming, right? And it's living up to this ideal. And I went through and looked at all of your work, and what I'm learning, and even going back and reading some of King's work, is that, and we all know this, a dream is not enough, right? It's not enough just to dream, but we have to make manifest those dreams. We have to actively create the America or the world that we envision. Now, I'm still not very clear about what I envision America to be or what America must become, because it's always been a little bit of shit for me. So I'm trying to wade through the muck and the mire of the past to envision a new future, right? So what I do know is that we must create, though. And what you all have done is created with the works of your hands, with the thoughts of your minds, with the strength of your spirits, an idea for us to ponder on around new futures, around new ways and new manifestations of America and of what it means to be a human being, right? So what I want to hear from you, because I am so cloudy on this, is what the hell does this country have to become? What are your thoughts around this sort of idea of America and the realization now that we all know that democracy is a process and an outcome, and it can be thwarted, right? So talk to me about your visions for America, about what America must become.
James Baldwin did not make his home in America. He left America. He lived in France. Mm-hmm. Richard Wright did not make his home in America. He left America. He lived in France. Baldwin and Richard Wright did not get along fabulously. There was an amazing tension between them. Yet, both of them denied living in America and decided to live somewhere else. And this tension is the most important part of it, of the relationship, because what it says is that there may not be the America we need. There can only be the America we fight for, because America does not want to be America. When you look at what happened recently, you have all of this uproar over Black Lives Matter. But I ask people one simple question: how many police did the Black Lives Matter movement kill? None. The Trump followers, how many police did they kill? 2. And nobody, and for the most part, we don't even say a word about those 2 policemen who were killed by the Trump followers, the supposed advocates of law and order. How is it that the advocates of law and order are the ones who could kill policemen and nobody says a goddamn thing? If Black people had done that, I don't have to go any further. Y'all understand what I'm saying? That's why America is not ready to be America. They'd rather kill policemen than be America. What y'all saying? I don't hear nothing. Crickets.
If I venture forward on that, going to what you said initially, making sense with each other. And we don't have the tools to make sense with each other. The events of yesterday notwithstanding, or 2 days ago, and the ongoing events, because we're still under an insurrection right now. I don't have an answer. I'm very pessimistic, frankly. And I don't have a very clear answer, but what you are saying, I think, with regard to that we fight to make that America exist is clearly an ongoing struggle, and it's a struggle with making sense with each other. And as we were talking earlier, or we were just discussing this idea of symbolic, we talk about, Andre, what you've done with the flag, but I think about what Shane is doing with maps, and it's a different symbolic structure to make sense, to look at the grid of a city, to look at the way that it's laid down, to understand the policies behind it, to understand how it affected individuals and displaced and made invisible and eradicated Black people in just this city, as Shana's work shows. But you could say that throughout all of America. And those are battle lines, both real and material and felt. They have long-lasting effects and stretch from then to now, but also are symbolic battle positions. And I guess all I would add is that, and this is maybe in line with Dr. King, the sense of a long arc of justice, is that we are in a war of positions. We are arranging pieces on a board and taking spaces, and that struggle is what ultimately defines the board for our current situation, our next generation. And symbols are not hollow. Symbols are very material. Symbols are not something that exists in the clouds. Symbols are the way we make sense with each other. We look at a map and we know where people live. It shows us how people are experiencing life and their lived experiences. And so a lot of the work ahead, I think, is a lot to do with remapping, redesigning the symbols to make sense with each other and to understand it in a very real material sense, that there are disparities that exist. They're very perceivable. and we have the tools and the symbols to show them and share them with each other. And that I think is tied to what I think Baldwin saw ahead, perhaps in that work, was it was not a fight for civil rights. It was a fight for a form of cultural belonging, and that he was laying claim to. We only might now be beginning to understand through this current struggle.
Mm.
Georgia and Kalamu, thank you both. I appreciate, Kalamu, you really stressing, well, David, I'm gonna start with you. And also you being transparent with us and everyone who's watching your own struggles with the tensions of the phrase, the title of the exhibition, and the meaning behind it, and the meaning that you connect to and clearly don't connect to. And Kalamu, I really appreciate you pointing out Baldwin's contradictions, as well as Richard Wright, in terms of they also stopped living in America, right? And also, what does it mean? And George, I appreciate you thinking about like how it's also time to remap, re-engage, reimagine. And even what does it mean to say America, how that also restricts and confines and limits. There's the Americas, right? There's so many more people beyond the continental United States. I am struck by the phrase dreaming while awake. And I'm reminded of, we've been here many, many times before. Many of us exist in a world that our ancestors imagined, conceived, and did the work to manifest, knowing that they would not exist in that world. This idea of thinking about freedom. I'm reminded of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work around the non-reformer reformer, this commitment to abolition and recognizing what is the work that we need to do now to manifest the work that we want to see tomorrow, or the world we want to see. I'm also reminded by a friend of mine, Andrea Smith, Indigenous woman, who spoke in Atlanta for the first U.S. Social Forum, and the theme was "Another World is Possible." And she took down the house when she said another world is possible because the US won't be necessary. And to me, I'm reminded about when we're thinking about make America what America must become, or what America can become, is the America, this idea of America. I think sometimes it's time for us to put that idea to sleep. Because if we're committed to dreaming while awake, some things need to be put to rest. And this idea of America that never included many of us, like I was not included in that America. So what is that investment in America that didn't include me? And so I think it may also turn some people off, but to me, it's really important that to commit myself through a Black feminist position, commit myself to exploring the possibilities and to reimagine more liberatory futures, not necessarily letting go of the past, but really engaging the past to help inform the present. And one of the things, as both a historian and a sociologist, a lot of my work, and then just a lot of things that we do in general, we have a tendency to be ahistorical and advocate for policies that we will otherwise be advocating against had we just studied and looked at the historical trajectory. And then there are those of us who engage in political activism and or study history, and we're apolitical, right? And so the two have to go hand, they inform each other. None of this is by accident. There's a lot of intentionality. And I think as we are committed to a different future, a future where we're not afraid to sit with the weight of the pain and violence of the past, which I'm also reminded of the work of Christina Sharp. And David, I know you want to take us there as well. And so to me, it's that there's that one, acknowledging the contradictions as well as the anxieties that exist, especially white racial anxiety of losing oneself, engaging the other, as opposed to just simply eating the other, right? To me, it's about the possibilities and also having new types of conversations and engaging in reimagined futures, not just sustaining things that no longer serve us or that never included many of us, especially Black people, especially Indigenous people, and Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas, not just those of us confined to North America or the continental US.
Yeah, wow. Go ahead, Andre.
Yeah, my response to the question, what should America become, I guess, is I think that America needs to, one, be more accountable, and two, more empathetic. I think that we, or just America, is trapped in this, or exists in this like trap of nostalgia and also like myth of progress, like kind of commenting to what you were saying, Shana, when people make America great again, like that is tied to like this ideal of like power and control, like exploitation, all these things that um, kind of stem from lack of accountability and lack of empathy. And I feel like as a country, we need to reconcile with that and start, seeing ourselves in others and stop fighting each other and allowing ourselves to like dream and others dream as well. I think that we have to continue to reevaluate symbols, like kind of bringing the conversation back to, why art and activism is so important. Really pushing forward new ways of thinking. Art informs science, it informs, language, it informs everything that we do, I believe. And I feel like um, as artists, as people, like this ideal of visualizing new futures, willingness to be vulnerable, that's like tied in this anxiety piece, where people aren't willing to like open. And that, and I understand that, I guess, because it's sometimes that can get you killed, like, and that's just the honest truth. But just I guess I don't have all the mechanics figured out as to exactly how we should, play out these things, but all those are tied to, this ideal of willingness, accountability, and empathy.
I love that. I'd like to add to your keywords, Andre, self-awareness. I feel like the US has such a lack of self-awareness. And I mean, that kind of goes for everybody. Because when I was in Senegal, I was there for about 2 months for a residency, an art residency. I was just not aware of um, how I would be read or understood, or just like the what it means to be an American, even if you are Black. And I mean, a lot of places in Europe, like Africans are getting, how can I say, they can tell if you're American. And that should say a lot. But the thing is that I think America just has a lack of awareness about itself as well as its role in the world. Um, like when I was in Senegal, the issues, I mean, Senegal was so focused on this was in 2016 when Trump first got into the office, and I was in Senegal, and all the news channels were focused on the U.S. All the while, the country next to us was going through a coup, and they were watching the U.S. And it makes me, when I think about what America must become, America has got to understand who it is in the grand scheme of things. We're not good. And I say we, unfortunately, the world does not look at us as necessarily as, this American is good, this American is bad, or what have you. They're looking at the politics. They're looking at how many people did they kill today in my family. And we're fighting those same fights here. It's I think about locations like this, which is the House of Slaves on Gorée Island in Senegal, and I think about how places like this are kept intact, whereas in the U.S. there's still myths and questions of were there even slave ships. Like I think that our lack of awareness shows itself not only in how we see ourselves in relationship to the rest of the world, but also how we understand ourselves in history. Like, we like to act like stuff didn't just happen to our grandparents. Like we like to act that, oh, this coup is like the first, or these white terrorists were like the first case of that. No, this is a syndrome. This is a disease. And if you are not aware of your own sickness, how are you going to become better? If you're not aware of your own sickness, how are you going to become better? And that's where I feel like when I think of the question, what must America become? I feel like that's a question that white America needs to ask itself. I feel like those of us who feel like America is our only option for a good life, or those of us who feel that America still has so much potential, I think we need to rest. Like, I've had so many great conversations with other Black women about, Black women who are artists, dancers, vocalists, what have you. And just realizing, wait a second, this is the silver lining to this past year, has been that we can reconsider what we don't need. We don't need to overwork ourselves. We don't need to labor for capitalism. In fact, this is kind of working out for us. Like actually sitting down and realizing, oh, I've done 2 or 3 things today. I need to rest. Because we've been force-fed capitalism. And without that self-awareness of how capitalism actually functions in this world, we're just going to continue doing it because we have nothing to compare it to. Because we're either not willing to, or we've been taught to not compare it to anything else.
Yeah, that. I'm going to push back a little bit, Ariel. I think white America does need to have a real conversation with itself about power and violence and its history, and what it continues to do, even though it knows it shouldn't be doing. I think, though, and King said this in this last speech, this last sermon, that our destinies are tied together. And you just said that when we go to other countries, folks know we're American, right? So from a global perspective, there is no difference between the white American and the Black American. You're just an American. And so we live, again, it goes back to this tension of that Kalamu talked about, of Baldwin and Wright, living in this tension of being American in a foreign land, of wanting to resist America, but also wanting it to live up to its potential, and realizing that unless I kind of help it along, it ain't going nowhere, because our destinies are tied together. So it's a joint problem, right? And this idea of symbols that George talked about earlier, and making sense of things. There does have to be this level of a willingness to understand or to be vulnerable, which is what Andre talked about, so that we can come together across the table and have a real dialogue across difference, to move this thing forward, if it's going to be moved forward at all. If not, then let it fail, right? It's still an experiment. And we don't know how it really works out in the end, because we're right in the middle of the damn thing, right? So I just want to bring that point up, but I want to get to, because our time is running short, I want to get to your work, right? And I'm going to start with Andre here. I was walking through with George, and I looked at and experienced Seal and Forget Me Nots, right? Forget Me Nots is my favorite of the two, Andre, but both, in my opinion, right, really focus on capturing the humanity of the people of humanity's birth, what I call Black people, right, who always come back to this question of how can we make something live up to its highest ideal? Now, why do we keep asking that question and others don't? That's something we have to talk about too, right? But it also celebrates difference and resistance, in my opinion, in reading both of those works. I read Fred Moten's Black and Blur, and Fred asked the question, how can we consent to not becoming a singular being? And when I look at Seal, that's what I think about. And when I look at Forget Me Nots, that's what I think about, right? So talk to me about your thoughts behind both of those pieces, and what were you trying to convey to us?
I'm so happy that you enjoy those pieces.
Yeah.
I think that with Forget Me Nots, I guess speaking towards this point, Ariel, of awareness, okay? I think that, well, I'll go on a bit of a tangent for such a bit. I think that Black and brown people in America have to exist in a level of self-awareness that white people don't. And there has been lots of psychological warfare that has been played upon Black and brown people, and that, you know, we have to consider that as we're talking about moving forward. So that's just something in the air. Specifically with Forget Me Nots, speaking towards this migration that I've experienced, I felt like, you know, being, you know, Midwest, kind of Northern Black, you know, Southern Black, those are all different, you know, that's the beauty of the diaspora. But in the South, you know, there's a lot of terror, I guess, that exists around the American South. You know, this terror of slavery, you know, like what has been done to Black and brown people, Black people specifically, I should say, you know, and with those photos, I did want to express, you know, a kind of humanness that exists, you know, show people that that are living freely, you know, show that there is a way to exist in all of this, and still, you know, kind of grasp this very convoluted concept of freedom, you know, kind of in your own way. I think that would seal that the move to put my silhouette in the stars was, you know, Ariel, you talked about this as well, taking ownership, and that existing as, you know, a humanness of freedom. I feel like moving with that type of philosophy, you know, kind of looking for the humanness, finding ways that we can relate, is very important. But it's also can be annoying at times, because I'm like, okay, like I'm the one that has to be the good guy here. Yo, white guy, you suck. You know, like your granddad sucks. You know, like I want to tell you that to your face, but you know, I also understand that to move us forward, you know, like it requires us, you know, kind of not leveling the playing field, but like trying to um, come meet each other where we are, I guess, and look towards our similarities to, like, you know, create this America that we may want to see, where we all, you know, not only survive, but thrive.
Thank you for that.
Mhm.
I'm also thinking now too about Shana and Ariel's work, right? And this very American notion of land and home and ownership, all of those things, right? One of my, and I wrote this to the panelists earlier about In the Wake on Being in Blackness by Christina Sharp, and one of my favorite passages from that work reads this: living in the wake means living the history and present of terror, from slavery to the present, as the ground of our everyday Black existence. Living the historically and geographically discontinuous, but always present and endlessly reinvigorated brutality in and on our bodies, while even as that terror is visited on our bodies, the reality of that terror are erased. Each of your work, to me, displays this sentiment or expresses this sentiment in different yet equally dynamic prisms. And so, Shana, I would like for you to talk to me about your work and housing, and how the intentionality behind residential, geographic, and spatial segregation, and what are you trying to tell us? You're on mute, Shana.
Sorry, thank you. I was just taking quick notes because you you collapse a lot of things in terms of housing, residential, geographic, and spatial. So first, thank you. Thank you for bringing Christina Sharp's work into this conversation, and also acknowledging the ways in which both my work and Ariel works reflect what Christina Sharp talks about in the way. For those who don't know, Kalamu and I have this big book love affair, and we always exchange books with each other. So Kalamu, if you don't have it, I have a copy for you of In a Way. So I'm excited about that. In terms of my work, I want to just pretty make clear, you mentioned this very early on, David, when I think you said Hannah Black, talking about the ways in which Black people were scattered all across the world. And for me, my work goes beyond housing, residential, spatial, and geographic. I'm talking about the ways in which that scattering I'm referring to as displacement, and the ways that we are committed to displacing Blackness. And many of us are able to engage that displacement through housing or through residential, through the geographic. And for me, it's very important, in order to displace a people, you have to confine them. To confine requires an extraction. It requires a commitment to policing, to blaming, to criminalizing, to disposing of, to erasing, to disappearance. And for me, in this country, we have done an amazing job of confining Black existence, Black life chances through our urban policies, through land use planning, and how we choose to house people, whether that is in segregated communities or whether that's in prisons. We know how to warehouse people very well. It's our job and responsibility to think differently about housing affordability and the types of housing that we want. But keep in mind, displacement does not solely resist within the realm of housing only. It is also, however, the best entry point to engage people into the conversation, right? And so I just want to just note that, especially. And when I'm thinking about Christina's work in the wake, again, I'm reminded about this idea of dreaming while awake, but thinking about what does the wake means. And for Christina, she's engaged in the concept of the wake, both as it relates to the wave that a ship makes, the water of behind the ship, the wake of the water. There's also the wake when we think about funerals, being present. Then there's awake, meaning like consciousness, being awake, aware of what's going on. But to be in the wake on Blackness and being is a commitment to love. In order to love, a commitment to loving Black people is also a commitment to work. And it's heavy work, heavy work. The work of being in the wake is very heavy, and it's also very violent. And what does that look like? And so when I'm thinking about our housing policies, I'm thinking about violent policies that are truly designed to make people that look like me disappear. And that's it. And Ariel, when you were speaking earlier about people not choosing to be aware, people are aware, white people are aware, people know. There's a commitment to erasing that history, to pretending like it didn't exist, which is another form of displacement. When you can change the narrative, you can engage in revisionist history. And so through the work that I created as part of my residency at the Contemporary Art Center, Displacing Blackness, the cartographies of violence, extraction, and disposability, I speak to many of these different issues, both through slavery, starting with the formation of the city of New Orleans, in the ways in which Black people was displaced and forced to create this city, thinking about the violence of the city's formation, thinking about the African burial grounds upon which the city of New Orleans stands, thinking also about the federal housing policies that have truly guided and reflect the very urban environments that many of us live in. Those housing policies are also directly related to Baldwin's work. And George, when you were speaking earlier about post-World War II, many of these policies was created post-World War II, or I'm sorry, on the eve of World War II and solidified after World War II. But it also speaks to the contradictions when we think about the New Deal policies, not just housing policy, when we think about even Social Security. It's also a time period when we saw eugenics rise its ugly head, when we saw a lot of people being sterilized. And these contradictions often work hand in hand. We see this again when we think about the 68, the Fair Housing Act of 68. It's also during a time period when a lot of Black women, Indigenous women, and Puerto Rican women are being sterilized against their will. Those contradictions are intense. The same occurs when we're thinking about, and some people may say these are not contradictions, right? The building of the US prison nation, as Bette Ritchie talks about, the prison nation, not so much mass incarceration, but the US as a prison nation, the building up of that prison nation. We see this again where, medical students are being taught how to sterilize through NARD plants, but how to put the NARD plant into low-income women's and Black women, poor women's arm, but not how to take them out. Another form of sterilization that's directly tied to the criminalization of Black communities. Also, as relates to mandatory minimum laws, we start to see again the buildup of the U.S. as a prison nation, of warehousing people, again being very committed to housing people, but not the type of housing that many of us are advocating for. And so through the work of displacing Blackness, again, I'm speaking to the contradictions of home ownership opportunities, the contradictions of public housing, the ways in which public housing construction was used to displace community and then rehouse them in the very developments that displaced them from the beginning. I'm speaking to personal narratives, my mother's own experiences of displacement. I'm speaking to not just the displacement of people, but also the ways in which people are resisting that displacement, the ruptures of that. I'm also bringing conversations between Black women organizing in public housing and also very subtly the ways in which Black women were primarily responsible for revolts on slave ships. The more likely you had, the highest percentage of Black women on a ship was the more likely that there would be a revolt on that ship. And so there are two different walls within the exhibit that are opposite each other, but they're in conversation with each other because of that particular point of resistance and protest. I'm also bringing in the archives and also the violence of the archives within the space. Engaging maps and engaging maps outside of ways that we would normally think about them, but also exposing the cartographies of violence within them, right? The violent landscape that makes New Orleans what it is, which is again a reflection of what America is. It is not by accident that New Orleans has one of the highest prison rates in the country, and Louisiana has one of the highest, and in the country as a state, let alone the U.S. in the world, right? Like this is not by accident, and there's a trajectory, there's a history that ties them all together, and that is racial slavery. Both when we think about our current housing policies, but also when we think about our commitment to disposing of people who no longer have a useful value when their political economy shifts from one of slave labor to overnight shifting. Then we think about the convict lease systems. Then we think about the fact that the Black people have always been a permanent majority of Angola, the prison population, both in this state, but also when you think about prisons in this country as well. So this work speaks to a lot of different pieces, both as relates to housing, especially when we're thinking about evictions, thinking about the racial wealth gap, think about public housing. Also, when we think about residential confinement, segregation, and then the geography of this place. So yes, I'm not sure if that's all that you was looking for, David, but there's a lot going on within.
Exactly what I was looking for. Thank you, Shana. I have lots of comments, and I wish I had more time to comment, but I want to move to Ariel. Ariel, your piece, again, talks about, is titled "The Future is a Constant Wake." And again, looking at Christina Sharp, she says, in the wake, the past is not past, the past that is not past reappears, always to rupture the present. And in the moment in the film where you uncover what I interpret as a skeletal remain, and it begins to lift from the ground, I think about this rupture of past into the present moment. Talk to us about what you were trying to convey in your film.
So I think, thank you, David. So I think the best way to describe the meaning of the work is how it was made. I was asked to, well, originally I was working with my friend and collaborator, Michael J. Love, and we share research, like, oh, did you know this? And we would go into each other's studios and share. And one of the things that he shared with me, or that we shared with each other, is the prevalence of burial mounds or burial sites in the US that Black people ancestors have been buried and paved over. Wall Street, there's a site in Texas where a university is actually built over. We also have the University of Texas at Austin here that has the remains of an indigenous chief, and they recently returned those remains. And so he and I were originally making this this video as a backdrop for his sort of, what is it? His kind of dissertation performance at the culmination of his years at the University of Texas, Austin, to get his graduate degree. And around the same time, a friend of mine asked me to submit a work to a screening that was happening in Philadelphia that was thinking about positive futures. And at the time, I was reading Christina Sharp in the Wake, got my copy too. And I was really struck by the first chapter, where she talks about being like defending the dead, or thinks through it. And she thinks through, like, what does it mean to defend the dead? And she pulls from her lived experiences of being next to the dying. And my family, unfortunately, we have a lot of traumatic deaths in our family. And so that was something that really, the idea of like, what's a positive future? My instinct was to respond through Christina Sharp, and to respond as in the same way that she is thinking about what does it mean to be in the wake. I wanted to sort of find my own understanding of what does it mean to be in the wake if we are always walking over the dead, essentially. So the poem that is being read is my sort of letter to the future. And I would say, like how I was describing poetry and how I understand it for my own purposes, is that I'm being vulnerable in that I am allowing myself to regurgitate my own thoughts, my own feelings, my own lived experiences, as well as the notes and thoughts that come out of reading Christina Sharp's work. So the way that I do research is, I think of it as like a lived experience research, where I'm not necessarily looking to write a PhD. I think, you brilliant people are great at doing that. For me and myself, what I'm trying to do is to convey raw emotion. So the work is the work. But I would like to say that I'm sorry I miscommunicated myself. Earlier on, David, you were pushing back on what I was saying in terms of, what America must become is a white issue. I still think it is, but I think that it's a white issue that involves us. And the degree of which we want to involve ourselves, I struggle with, because I feel that time and time again, Black people are being told, do the work, we'll try to understand what you're saying. And I'm tired of that. I don't think it works. I think that what I've seen that does work is that white institutions, people who claim to be aware, but prove time and time again that they are not, because there is a selective use of information, a selective use of archives that are restricting or restrictive upon the lived experiences that make our cultures rich. I feel that this question of who's going to do the labor is extremely important. And what labor are we talking about? Because I think I was joking with my partner. I was like, by this point in time, the way that Black and brown people have to be aware of whiteness, we know whiteness to a T.
Yes, Lord.
We know what it looks like. We know what it smells like. We can forecast it. We can warn our neighbors if it's coming. We can describe it. And that's not reciprocated. And the way that it has been, I think, reciprocated has been detrimental to us. So that's what I mean when I say awareness of not just being like, oh, I know slavery happened. Oh, I know this site, you know, all the hardcore facts, but it's like, are you aware spiritually? Are you aware that these people around you are hurting? Are you aware of the privilege and the power that you have in getting information wrong? So that's where I'll end that.
No, I think, thank you, Harry. I think that is, I live in this constant tension, and people who know me know this, between let's dialogue across difference for understanding and let's just burn the motherfucker down, right? So I live in this space all day long because of that, because we've had to study whiteness for our own survival. I know what it looks like. I know what every crinkle of the nose, every hand motion, every twitch of the lip, I know what it means because I've had to study whiteness for my survival. They've not had to study us in the same way, right? And part of that is a blessing and part of that's a curse. And so, you know, I hear you loud and clear, and I agree with you. For our last question, unfortunately, for this wonderful panel, it's a very simple question. And I'm gonna try and have you answer it very simply with one sentence. What is your waking dream?
Intimacy that respects both parties.
The ability to love hard and die.
A renewed commitment to the relationships that that we are accountable for and that we must show empathy towards.
I would say a commitment to exploring what has yet to be possible and to embrace what has yet to be imagined.
And our elder.
I guess you're talking about me. I'll take it a different place. Without Black women, we can forget all the rest of this shit. And that Black women are, have been, and will always be the fundamental source of humanity, whether we respect their humanity or not.
Yes.
There is no humanity without Black women. And what is difficult for most of us to accept is that a woman is more important than a man. A man cannot produce a woman. A woman can produce a man.
You know.
Hey, Anna Julia Cooper told Du Bois, you know.
That is, yes. I got to sit with all of those after this call for a minute. I want to thank each of you for sharing with us, for being in community with us, for being vulnerable, and for sharing your work with us. I believe the evolution of revolution is a present act that stretches back and reaches forward. I think art and artist activism allows us to understand the past, to actively work to change the present, and to imagine new futures. art for me is a portal, right? So I'll end as I began, invoking the spirit of our dear brother, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and the ferocious spirit of our dear sister, Toni Morrison. It is in these times, 2 days before the inauguration of a new government, which will bring with it new hope and most assuredly new challenges. But this is precisely the time, as Toni Morrison wrote, when artists go to work. There is no time for despair. There is no place for self-pity, no need for silence, and surely there's no room for fear. We speak, we write, we do language, we create. This is how civilizations heal, and each of you are healers. Thank you again to our panelists, to the Contemporary Arts Center team, and to all of you for tuning in. Stay woke, be of good courage, be well. Good afternoon.